We've been on the road for 4 days, and the trip has been mostly uneventful. Nash and Thunra were pummeling some semblance of a fighting style into Nick, and we're making great time on our way to the capital. The only thing we've run into so far is other travelers, and because of this, our spirits are high. Well, except for Nick's. I grinned at the boy as he collapsed into his seat, fresh from sparring with Thunra. My grin was met with a stoic, yet weary expression. His training had been difficult, but I'd only had to help heal him once. 10 does an amazing job at keeping Nick functional. My grin faded as the AI came to mind. I recalled the metal box that fell out of the dungeon creature's splattered brains. There's little doubt that it contained a being like 10, and 10 had also seemed to know to look for it, although that could be attributed to amazing reaction time. If the crazed human in the dungeon had an AI in its head, who was controlling the body? Perhaps the AI was like 10 before it woke up, and the human simply lost his mind due to the tragic nature of his situation. He had to have been down there for a very long time, so that could have cost him his sanity as well. Being alone in the dark for years, perhaps even decades, it was no wonder he turned feral. I supposed it is also possible that the AI had gone insane along with the human. If something can think, it can likely also feel, and anything that can feel can go mad. This begets the question, which went insane first? Did the human's insanity cause the AI to go feral, or did the AI's insanity cause the human to lose it? "Are we there yet?" Nick asked, jarring me from my thoughts. "Nope. Soon, though," Imlor answered. "If all goes well, we'll be at the outskirts of the capital around dusk. We'll make camp there, and be at your destination by noon tomorrow." "Why haven't we run into anything killable yet?" I laughed and said, "We got lucky. Imlor has taken us on an adventurer's route, which would normally be a more dangerous option. I suspect that the reason for our luck is all the other travelers we've seen so far. Since they are also adventurers, they would have fought any monsters they came across." "I was sure we were going to be able to fight something when we went through the swamp," Nick muttered. "Now we're back in the forest, though." "Feeling a bit aggressive, are we?" I asked condescendingly. "Not going to lie to you, Yulk. Yes, I am. Very. Nash and Thunra are leagues above me when it comes to experience. I'm rarely able to even land a hit," he ranted. "It's not good for my confidence, you know." "Well, the High Chief will have a quest waiting for us. Maybe it will involve fighting monsters." "I hope so." "It's not so bad," Imlor interjected. "You got some new skills, right?" "Yeah," Nick sighed. 2 skills in 4 days. "You say that like you were expecting more," I said. "A new skill every 2 days is quite a feat, even with trainers like Thunra and Nash." "Really?" "Yes. Most people unlock skills as they go, and usually in combat with tough monsters. Training a new skill outside of combat can take weeks. That's one of the reasons I opted to go into magic instead of melee." I grinned again. Nick laughed. "It's not like you had much of a choice, though, right?" "Sure I did. I could have been a warrior like Nash, and it would have been just as hard for me as it was for him. But since I was blessed with a better-than-average magic core, I was able to dedicate my time to magic instead. Since it's extremely difficult to train both martial and magical prowess simultaneously, everyone was very understanding when I chose magic, and didn't bother to learn to swing an axe. "So what you're saying is that I've got it lucky?" He laughed again. "How come it doesn't feel like it?" "It's pretty common to be lucky, and also completely oblivious to it," I answered. Nick fell into silent contemplation as everyone else finished loading into the carts. As we continued our journey, I wondered about Nick's propensity for advancement in regards to his skills. It seems to go a bit beyond him simply being a natural at combat. Could it be something related to his species, perhaps? Maybe humans are simply a jack-of-all-trades kind of race. On the other hand, the creature from the dungeon didn't use any magic. It could be that it was unable to due to its mental state. Some monsters stop using magic when they frenzy, and if a sorcerer is sufficiently stressed, their spells are affected as well. It's entirely possible that at one point it could use magic, so perhaps we should simply be thankful that it couldn't at the time. Come to think of it, Nick described his magic channels as being straight. I didn't put much thought into it at the time, wrote it off as an odd quirk of an unfamiliar species, but after seeing the metal box fall out of that other human's head, I can't help but wonder, are they artificial? Nick had said that the world he comes from doesn't have magic, but could that be due to the fact that humans simply can't naturally use magic? Why would someone go through the effort of making sure humans could use magic? What materials would one even use to create an artificial magic core and channels? No, that's not even the biggest problem with this line of thought. How would one possibly create the magic that fills the core, and in such quantities to power through a misconceived visualization trigger? Nick's wind spear had been very powerful for a beginner, and I had been under the impression that it was due to his knowledge of the concept of wind. After hearing him explain how he thought wind worked to Matri, well, it can't be denied that he had inadvertently put a massive amount of magical force into the spell, like a beast that doesn't know its own strength trying to use a fragile piece of equipment. Thrilling, I muttered to myself. Several pairs of eyes turned to look at me simultaneously. I waved a hand in a nonchalant way to indicate I was speaking to myself. Don't worry, he gets like that sometimes, Nash said in my defense. The eyes went about their business and left me to sum up my thoughts. Nick has a massive amount of potentially artificial core magic, and I have no way of determining if that magic is natural or not without hurting the boy. Damn it all, we should have performed an autopsy on the feral one. It had simply not occurred to me at the time. I was more concerned with the fact that we survived the encounter. Which skills did you learn anyway? Imlor asked Nick, bringing me back to reality. Preternatural evasion and knife hand, Nick answered. Knife hand? I asked. Yeah, it makes my hand hard when I do this. He held up his outstretched hand with all his fingers pressed tightly together. And that makes my karate chops do a lot of damage. It can also intimidate weaker enemies if I point it at them. Huh, sounds handy, I grinned. Everyone had been listening in and were punished for their nosiness by my wordplay. I met the groans with a chuckle. Right, so puns aside, what does preternatural evasion do? Imlor asked. It lets him automatically dodge attacks that can be dodged, Thunra answered. Both skills are very useful for weaponless brawling. I looked at Nash and gave him a slightly smug smirk, then turned back to Nick. So you didn't learn any sword skills? I asked with a malicious grin. No, he fucking didn't, Nash growled. And if you're trying to imply that it's my fault, I'll kick your ass right off this cart. Oh no, I would never dream of blaming Nick's swordsmanship instructor for his lack of sword skills, I said with measured sarcasm. My skin is tougher than your words, Nash replied while crossing his arms. You won't rile me up. Any further than he already has? Matri asked innocently. Oh, so now it's a group effort, is it? Nash shouted. Our laughter rang out through the trees and almost masked the sound of wood crunching. Everyone except for Imlor stopped laughing and immediately turned towards the sound. Stop the cart, I said. Dibs, Nick shouted as he leapt from the cart. The hell does dibs mean? Nash asked as he jumped after Nick. I waited for the cart to come to a halt before climbing off. Nick and Nash were joined by Thunra, whom I hadn't even seen move. They were already about 50 yards ahead of me. Nick reached for his belt and then, remembering he doesn't have a sword, slowed to allow the other two to catch up. Before they could, though, two thick trees turned to splinters as a massive red and yellow beast crashed through them. It took a second to gain its bearings and then roared a challenge at us, exposing rows of fangs and a tongue with a stinger on the tip. Its four eyes focused on Nick, and it stepped forward. What the hell is that thing? Nick shouted. Nash glanced at me, unsure of what we were looking at. Fair, considering we hadn't seen one before. The coloration was confusing, not designed to supply camouflage in a forest at all. But that's because it isn't designed to be camouflaged, nor is it supposed to be in a forest. Its domed skull covered in metallic spikes told me exactly what it was. It's a Nahalim, Thunra shouted. Get back! A Nahalim, a creature created in a twisted time of disastrous war, designed specifically to breach barricades and destroy defenders while drawing attention away from other attackers. The 3 claws on each limb were capable of cracking through stone like the sharpest of picks, and to add to its lethality, its creators had made it venomous. A terrible creature, and most unfortunate that we find one so close to the capital. We have to kill it. Rapes di Nutzak, Nick shouted, ignoring the sage advice that the brawler had given him. Wind slashed around us as his spell launched toward the Nahalim. It was a very powerful attempt, and I covered my eyes to protect them from the dust it kicked up. Despite the foolishness of the action, I found myself with a sense of pride for my pupil. Once the wind died down, though, Nick was on the ground with a very nasty-looking gash in his chest. Joni rushed past me to his aid. Knowing that Joni would keep Nick alive, I focused on the Nahalim. It wasn't undamaged, but its injury could be considered a minor flesh wound for one of its ilk. Its metallic skull glimmered in the sun, and 2 of the spikes had been shorn clean off. Ochre-colored blood oozed from the flesh still clinging desperately to the remaining spikes. No, Wind Spear wouldn't work against such a foe. There's a specific class of spell one must cast to destroy a Nahalim, and it has to be a powerful one. The monster shook its head and stepped toward Nick and Joni, clearly angry at the injury it sustained. Nash and Thunra stepped in, slashing and punching respectively. The creature's attention turned, and it immediately began fighting them. I dropped my staff and raised both hands, feeling the arcane energies swell within my head. I focused on the glimmer of the Nahalim's exposed skull, and decided which spell to use. Nash and Thunra were in the way, though, dodging tooth, tongue, and claw. "Get out of the way!" I shouted. The 2 veteran fighters glanced at me for a millisecond before making a run for it. The Nahalim looked at the 2 of them, unsure of which one to pursue. The hair on my arms stood on end as I began my visualization. Electrical energy, unbelievably powerful, moving at the speed of light toward the exposed metal. Tlub Srolmitzak! My eyes felt as if they were on fire. My chest felt as if it had been kicked by a narce, and my arms burned as the lightning bolt traveled from me to the Nahalim. The strike was instant, and giant monster collapsed to the ground. I grinned in satisfaction as my legs gave out, and I fell to my knees. I gasped through the pain, letting it roll through me and keeping myself calm as it did so. It's just a little pain, no need to panic. "Yulk!" Nash shouted as he ran up to me. "Are you hurt?" "Yes, but it's fine," I waved him off. "Imlor's bolt is a hell of a spell, brother. How's Nick?" "He seems all right," Thunra answered as he approached. "Not even bleeding anymore. Joni looks like he's seen a ghost, though. You sure you're okay?" "Yes," I said, grabbing my staff and rising to my feet. "It's pain, not an injury. It's just one of the costs of the spell." "Huh?" they asked in unison. "Most spells just cost magic to cast, but certain spells cost a little something extra. A sort of curse to remind one to use the spell sparingly," I explained. "Never mind that. Let's check on Nick." They eyed me warily as we walked over to Joni and Nick. Thunra was right. Joni looked terrified. His pale face looked up at us and he pointed to Nick. It spoke," he whispered. "What's that? Speak up." Thunra held a hand to his ear. He said, "It spoke." "By it, I'm assuming he means 10, I said. "The robot in Nick's head?" "The very same." "Oh, cool," Thunra grinned. Joni looked at us, his shock turning to incredulity and finally to anger. You knew the AI could use Nick to talk?" he demanded. "Oh, come on, Joni. Give him the benefit of the doubt," Thunra interjected. "The AI used Nick's body to fight before. Why wouldn't it be able to use his mouth to talk? Common sense." "Actually, Thunra, we did know," Nash said sheepishly. 10 talked to us after the fight with the altered human." "Oh, how come you didn't say nothing?" "We didn't quite get the chance, if you'll recall," I said with a grin. "And after that interaction, we thought it best to keep it between us. Joni, step aside, please. I need to ask 10 something before Nick wakes up." Joni looked offended, but moved so that I could kneel down. He muttered a curse under his breath and crossed his arms. 10, can you hear me?" I asked. "Yes," Nick's voice said. "How is Nick doing?" "He's stable. Joni's healing was very helpful. He'll be waking up soon." "Good," I nodded. "Now then, why didn't you take control of his body like you did in the dungeon?" I caught 3 surprised expressions in my peripheral vision. "I tried," 10 said in a whining tone that surprised me. "He stopped me. I didn't even know he could do that." "How?" I asked. I do not know. He shouldn't have been able to. If that attack had been a little bit stronger or a millimeter to the left, we'd have died. Did you try to take control before he cast Wind Spear or after? Nash asked. Before. It took half a second to fully detail the beast once I had a clear view of it, and I determined that Nick would not have been able to defeat it. I attempted to gain control but was unable to. He simply didn't go under, Ten explained. That's the second time I've experienced panic. Not enjoyable. Don't mean to be mean, buddy, but it's his body, Thunra interjected. Can't expect him to be willing to just hand it over at the drop of a hat. We could have died, Ten said softly. He's waking up now. Goodbye. We stared in uncomfortable silence at Nick's unconscious form. He looked peaceful, like a sleeping child, an illusion that was quickly shattered when he began coughing roughly and sat up. What happened? He asked. You nearly died, dumbass, Nash immediately answered. Next time an over 20 tells you to get back, you better fucking listen. Hey! Matri shouted from behind us. How's Nick? He's fine, Thunra called out as Matri and Yisith ran over. We checked the perimeter, Yisith said. Looks like we're clear. They looked at the corpse of the Nahalim, flames flickering where its eyes used to be. A lot more of its metallic endoskeleton was showing now. I couldn't help but be a little proud. Let's get back on the road, I said. Ulurmak, you old fucker. I feel like it's been years. How have you been? A dwarf dressed head to toe in the finest fashions and walking with an exaggerated swagger that he knew annoyed those around him, strolled into my office. If I hadn't known who it was by his voice, I'd have known who it was by his ability to slip past Rezun. Lyath Haln, a mur of business and a self-proclaimed double agent. A real double agent would never admit to being one, even under hours of torture. The reason for that is pretty simple. Admitting to being a spy is a surefire way to make certain that you die painfully and your family no longer has a place to live. In some nations, your family will actually face the same punishment that you do. Thankfully for Lyath, he's not actually a spy, simply an information broker and a secret messenger between the High Chiefdom of Kirkina and the Empire of Kalkuti. On occasion, he'll stumble upon a juicy bit of information while on his drunken benders and pass the word along, but he doesn't seem to favor one nation over the other. He takes some getting used to, but once you do, he's a good friend to have. Able to switch gears from serious to silly in mere moments, great to unwind with, and despite his annoying demeanor, he's somehow pleasant to be around, an enigma to be sure. It's only been months, Lyath, but I've been in good health. How about yourself? I replied with a grin. Ha! I see you've been counting the days, then. I couldn't be better, he said, grabbing a seat. Met myself a sexy little elfie who's been keeping me entertained the last few days. About fucking time, too. I'd been on a desert-level dry spell. How's business? I interrupted, not wanting to hear about his debauchery. Ah, straight to it then, he said with a measure of disappointment. Well, business has been right fucking dark as of late. Good, but dark. The Drow are definitely planning an attack, and there's something shitty about it. Shitty? I asked. Yes, absolutely shitty. Stinks to High Haven, it does. The last few times they've attacked, it's been unorganized and just generally amateurish. Their entire fucking strategy was to give a bunch of bastards sharpened sticks and shove them at the enemy. Yes, I recall, I said. The ill-conceived strategies of the inbred bastard king. What's different this time? They've got God's damned formations. I narrowed my eyes at the dwarf. Has something happened to the inbred bastard? The death of Ymlofen would be disastrous for everyone neighboring the Drow. His incompetence and habitual political executions had kept the bloodthirsty culture of the Night Kingdom in check for half a century. The only things he's really good at is staying in power and killing those smart enough to help him be an effective king. He's uncannily good at the latter, almost as if he's deliberately trying. His family shrub was confusing to the point of being legendary. He is a third-generation royal, and I use that term loosely, whose grandparents were two sets of identical twins that had two children who then brought Lofen into this world, committing adultery in the process. Each and every one of these individuals had inbreeding in their direct lineage as well. Thankfully, Lofen was an only child, so the inbreeding stopped with him. Not that I've heard of. and that kind of news would leave a pretty big splash. Hell, there's bets on whether or not Lofin's immortal. How he's avoided what must be an entire fucking army of assassins at this point is beyond the ken of mortals. Regardless, someone else is definitely in charge this time around. Someone the shithead can't bully into being stupid. Any ideas on who that could possibly be? Nope, but whoever it is definitely has a pair, so that eliminates the princes. Lofin's 3 sons were smarter than their father, but deathly afraid of him. That's only natural, considering that he's had a total of 7 children. Nothing will make you scared of your father more than watching him publicly execute your older brothers and sisters. Their upbringing by the inbred bastard king had turned them into cowards. Unfortunately, intelligent cowards turn into very dangerous rulers, so only the drow were hoping for Lofin to die. Damn, sounds like this fight with the drow is going to have to be taken seriously, I said, leaning back in my seat. Sure as shit, Leith said with a sympathetic smile. Want a drink to take your mind off it? He pulled out a flask and shook it. This particular flask was enchanted with a spell that caused it to refill itself with a very strong alcohol called tak, a cursed thing, responsible for many forgotten nights and awkward mornings in my youth. I'm not about to go on a drunken bender when it's just after noon, Leith, I laughed. Plus, I've got an appointment soon. Oh? An appointment that you don't want to blow off? Do tell. Well, have you heard any rumors about a human? You're pulling my sack. The thing they pulled out of a fucking dungeon in New Leva? That's the one, I grinned. It's registered as an adventurer and everything, so I've got an extra special job for it. It's on its way here right now. Well, fuck me running. Don't suppose you'd let an old pal sit in all quiet like, Come on, don't be like that. This might be my only chance to see it. Be a fucking pal, Ulermach. I guess I could be convinced to let you stay. I rubbed my chin theatrically. If you help convince Emperor Jack to accept my proposal. Eh? You trying to get married to Jack? Gods damn it, no. My proposal regarding that thrice cursed mine. He wants to send his boys to mine it out for a steep cut of the ore. I want him to teach my boys how to mine more efficiently while giving him a more reasonable cut of the ore. Ah, shit. Had me all excited there for a second. Of course, it's about that fucking mine, though, Lyeth deflated. You know he's just about obsessed with the fucking thing. It'll be a hard sell, but he owes me some pretty big favors. I'll give it my best shot. That's all I can ask, I said. Fine. You are permitted to stay. As my old friend grinned in response to my decision, Rezun entered the room. Ah, perfect timing, I smiled. What is it? Your appointment has arrived, he said, eyeing Leith warily. He's going to be sitting in... Of course, Rezun sighed. The human has arrived along with his adoptive brothers and the over-20s. The over-20s have been paid out, and Yisith awaits debriefing. New Leva has also sent a messenger for another matter. Lyeth's eyebrow raised, and I smiled slyly. Of course he wouldn't have heard anything about that. A living thing coming out of a dungeon is national news that travels like wildfire, but a strong monster within a dungeon is business as usual. Send them in, I ordered. I'll meet with the messenger afterwards. Yes, High Chief, Rezun said, and left the room. Leith didn't even get the chance to interrogate me before Rezun returned, accompanied by Yisith, 2 other orcs, and a strange, pale-looking creature with dark hair and round ears. I quickly surmised that this must be the human. They stood next to each other in front of my desk, and Rezun adopted a very formal pose. I braced myself for what was coming. High Chief Ulermach, son of Grashna the Giant, savior of Kirkana, slayer of dragons, decimator of drow, conqueror of the dragon's jaw giants, blood ally of Bolasir, dear friend of the Empire of Kalkuti, and High Commander of the Kirkana Adventurers Guild, I present to you Yisith Mulach, champion of Melrune, Nash and Yolk Alta of Clan Alta, and Nick Smith of Clan Alta. And so you have, I replied. You may continue your duties. Thank you, High Chief, Rezun said with a bow and left the room. I gazed at my visitors. The 3 orcs were very well behaved, standing straight and keeping their eyes trained just above my head. Their parents taught them well. I turned my gaze to the human, who was also standing straight but staring directly into my eyes as if it were my equal. This surprised me for a moment. "You must be Nick Smith, adopted into Clan Alta," I said. "Yes, sir." "Well, Nick Smith, you must not have high chiefs where you're from. I say this because it is remarkably rude to look one in the eye." I smiled slightly. "Unless, of course, you've known them for quite a long time. Have we met before?" "No, sir." Its eyes left mine. "Apologies, sir." "No apologies necessary as long as corrections are made. Thank you for observing our customs," I said. "Now, Yesith, go ahead with your report." "Yes, High Chief," Yesith said. She began explaining the events of their mission, and I struggled to keep a stoic expression. A lost language, artificially intelligent machines fused with flesh, the human fighting the monster while the over-20s struggled, the fact that it wasn't actually the human fighting, the threats made by Clan Alta in regards to the human's well-being, and finally the fact that the monster in the dungeon was a horrifically altered human. "By Bibby's balls," Leith muttered under his breath once the report concluded. "Indeed," I replied. "Thank you, Yesith. You may go." Yesith nodded, turned, and left the room. I looked at my remaining guests. Nick's face had the appearance of someone who had just received startling information, but was trying to hide their concern. Yulk and Nash looked completely unperturbed. "Nash, Yulk," I began, "you really shouldn't be throwing your clan's weight around like that. You and I both know that the decision to avenge you would have been a controversial one, to say the least." "Yes, High Chief," Yulk said. "But if I may say something in our defense—" I tried not to grin. "Go right ahead. We weren't left with much choice. On our honor, we would have had to defend the boy against 4 over-20s. At least that's what we thought at the time." Yulk's cheeks twitched as he tried not to grin. "If they had killed us, which they likely would have, our mother would have called for their blood. I'm led to believe you personally know Yilda Alta." I couldn't help but wince at the mention of flesh-carver Yilda. Her spite is that of legends, and resisting her will is tantamount to trying to tell a waterfall to stop pouring. It was incredibly like her to randomly adopt a completely unknown creature that was discovered in a dungeon. "Yes, of course. She's done a lot for this chiefdom," I said. "Well then, it's a good thing you warned the adventurers off, I suppose." "Yilda Alta. Haven't seen her in years. How's she been, boys?" Lyeth asked. "She's been well," Nash answered, "though she wanted me to tell you, High Chief, that she is displeased about the sudden summons of her sons, and she feels that she should get some time to spend with her boys in her golden years." "Oh, please," I laughed. "She's probably thrilled to be having you follow in your father's footsteps, though I suppose I should make sparing use of you, just in case she comes at me with a slipper." The 2 orcs were close to breaking down with laughter, and the human actually smiled. "Find a place to sit. I've got a mission for you," I said, pointing at the pile of cushions. The 3 of them grabbed a cushion, sat down, and looked at me expectantly. I couldn't help but smile when I noticed that Nick was still avoiding eye contact. It's a subtle shift from formal to informal, to be sure. "You can look at me now, Nick. When I offer you a seat, things become a lot less formal," I explained. "Oh, right," the boy stammered. "Hi, Chief, I don't mean to be rude, but we do have our own mission to think of," Yulk said. "Oh?" I asked. "What would that be?" "We need to discover as much about Nick as possible. The language on the altar that Yesith mentioned is likely Draken. If we're to know what it says, we need to find a scholar who can read it." "Well, what a coincidence," I grinned.